Just stop for one moment. Look at this street. Look carefully at what is lying here. These people did not run. They did not hide. They did not even scream for help. They simply stopped, right here. Right in this exact spot where you are looking right now, 4,000 years ago. And for 100 years of modern archaeology, nobody has been able to fully explain why. Until today. Here's what makes this case truly unique. For decades, the internet has been feeding you one version of this story. Ancient nuclear war, radioactivity 50 times above normal. Skeletons holding hands. Bricks melted into glass by a blast so powerful it could only have come from a weapon that should not have existed 4,000 years ago. It is a compelling story. A terrifying story, and almost none of it is true. But here is what nobody tells you. The real story, the one built on actual evidence. On forensic reports. On original excavation logs from 1922. On brand new climate simulations completed in 2025. That real story is not less shocking than the myth. It is more shocking. And it carries a warning for our own future that we cannot afford to ignore. In the next 12 minutes, you are going to discover 3 things that most people on this planet will never know. First, the real reason 40,000 people vanished and why the nuclear theory is built entirely on a single translation error made 60 years ago. Second, what the physical evidence actually shows when you remove the myths and look at the hard science directly. Third, the final answer. The real conclusion that combines forensic anthropology, climate science, and urban history into the most disturbing explanation of all. An explanation that forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about our own civilization today. But before we get there, you need to understand exactly what kind of city we are talking about. Because Mohenjo-daro was not just an ancient settlement. It was the Silicon Valley of the Bronze Age. Imagine a city designed and built in 2500 before the Common Era. A city that looks like it was planned by a modern urban engineer sitting at a computer with the latest city planning software. We are talking about a perfect grid layout. Primary streets 8 meters wide. Specifically designed to handle heavy ox cart traffic moving in multiple directions simultaneously. This was not accidental. This was deliberate, sophisticated, masterfully executed. The residential buildings were multi-story structures made from precision-baked brick, uniform in size, consistent in quality, produced at industrial scale. And then there were the wells. Over 700 individual wells serving the population of this city. That is approximately 1 well for every 3 houses. While the rest of the ancient world was struggling with basic survival and fighting over water sources, Mohenjo-daro had solved the problem completely with breathtaking engineering. But the detail that truly separates this civilization from everything else in the ancient world is their drainage system. A fully decentralized regulated drainage network. Covered brick channels running beneath the streets carrying household waste and water away from residential areas. Away from food supplies. Away from drinking water. A public health infrastructure so advanced that it remains more sophisticated than the plumbing systems found in some modern towns across the world today. These were not primitive people. These were not superstitious cave dwellers making sense of a world they could not understand. These were engineers, planners, scientists of their age. So what happened to them? This is where the ancient nuclear war theory takes complete control of the conversation online. And we need to address it directly and honestly before we can talk about what actually happened. You have seen the claims. Radiation levels 50 times higher than normal found in the soil. Skeletons found glowing with residual radioactivity. Bricks vitrified and melted into glass that only nuclear temperatures could produce. The Mahabharata describing weapons that sound exactly like atomic bombs. All of it packaged into a story that spreads across the internet faster than any archaeologist can correct it. Here is where that radiation claim actually comes from. We traced it back through the decades of repetition, and what we found is remarkable in its own way. The 50 times higher radiation myth does not come from an archaeologist. It does not come from a peer-reviewed scientific study. It does not come from any laboratory analysis of Mohenjo-daro's soil or skeletal remains. It comes from a 1965 Russian book called Riddles of Ancient History written by an author named Alexander Grabovsky. Grabovsky cited a scientific paper about a rib bone taken from a 4,000-year-old Egyptian mummy. The original science was straightforward and unremarkable. The bone showed low alpha particle activity, a minor and expected finding in ancient organic material. But through a series of translation errors and misinterpretations passing through multiple languages and multiple decades, that Egyptian mummy rib bone became an Indian skeleton from Mohenjo-daro. And the low alpha activity became radiation 50 times above normal levels. There has never been a single peer-reviewed scientific study that confirmed anomalous radioactivity at Mohenjo-daro. Not one. It is one of the most successful games of broken telephone in the history of popular archaeology. A mummy's unremarkable rib bone transformed over 60 years into the cornerstone of an ancient nuclear apocalypse myth. Now what about the vitrified bricks? The areas where ground appears to have turned to glass and bricks show evidence of extreme heat on one side? Surely that requires temperatures only achievable through nuclear reaction? Not quite. When archaeologists carefully examined these so-called blast zones, they found something far more interesting than bomb craters. These areas are ancient industrial dumping grounds. Sites where broken pottery fragments and manufacturing slag were discarded by the city's workers over generations. Because Mohenjo-daro was not just a residential city. It was a massive manufacturing hub, an industrial powerhouse of the ancient world. The craftsmen of Mohenjo-daro operated double-chamber updraft kilns. Kilns specifically engineered to reach temperatures of 1500 degrees Celsius or above. They used these kilns to produce specialized stoneware ceramics and faience objects of extraordinary quality and precision. Objects that have been found at trading sites thousands of kilometers away from the city itself, proving that Mohenjo-daro was exporting manufactured goods across the ancient world. The melted and vitrified materials found at these sites were not the aftermath of destruction. They were the byproduct of creation. The physical evidence of a civilization that had achieved complete mastery over high-temperature industrial processes at a time when the rest of humanity was still working with basic hand tools. The blast zones were not where the city died. They were where the city thrived. So if there was no nuclear blast, what about the skeletons? What about the famous image of bodies lying face down in ancient streets that launched 1,000 theories? Sir Mortimer Wheeler conducted influential excavations at Mohenjo-daro and famously pointed to these skeletal remains as evidence of a violent massacre. He dramatically accused the ancient deity Indra of destroying the city through military conquest. It was a vivid and memorable argument that captured the public imagination completely. But when biological anthropologist Kenneth Kennedy and his team finally conducted proper forensic analysis of these skeletal remains, they found something that contradicted Wheeler's massacre theory entirely. There was virtually no perimortem trauma present on any of the bones. No sword marks, no axe wounds, no arrow impacts. No signs of the kind of violence that leaves permanent marks on human bone. No evidence whatsoever of the close-quarters combat that a military invasion of a densely populated city would inevitably produce. But the finding that truly dismantled the massacre theory was this. The skeletons were found in completely different layers of soil. Different layers of soil mean different time periods. These individuals did not all die together in a single violent event. They died decades apart, some possibly centuries apart. Their bodies were found together not because they were massacred simultaneously, but because their remains had been preserved together by the specific soil conditions of the site. They were not massacre victims. They were simply citizens of a great city whose bones happened to survive in the same location across different generations of occupation. So we have removed the nuclear blast. We have removed the radiation. We have explained the vitrified bricks. We have dismantled the massacre theory. Which brings us to the question that actually matters. What really happened to 40,000 people in the most advanced city on Earth? The answer comes from 3 separate streams of evidence that have only recently been brought together into one coherent picture. Forensic anthropology, archaeological stratigraphy, and new climate simulation data from 2025 that has changed everything researchers thought they understood about the end of the Indus Valley's civilization. The picture that emerges is not a single dramatic catastrophic event. It is something slower, something more complex, and ultimately something far more frightening because of what it reflects about our own world today. The climate data is unambiguous. Beginning around 1900 before the Common Era, the monsoon patterns that had sustained agriculture across the Indus Valley for centuries began to shift. Rainfall decreased. Rivers changed course. The agricultural land that had fed a population of hundreds of thousands across dozens of connected cities began to dry and fail season after season. At the same time, something was happening inside the city itself. The archaeological layers show a gradual but unmistakable decline in the quality of urban management. Buildings that collapsed were rebuilt with lower quality materials. The sophisticated drainage systems that had been the pride of the civilization began to fall into disrepair and were not maintained. The careful urban planning that had defined Mohenjo-daro for centuries gave way to overcrowded informal construction filling in the spaces between original structures. A civilization under pressure, stressed by climate, stretched by population, slowly losing the institutional capacity to maintain the systems that had made it extraordinary. And then disease. Skeletal analysis from the final occupation layers of Mohenjo-daro shows increased evidence of nutritional stress and infectious disease in the population. A weakened people in a declining city facing failing harvests and deteriorating infrastructure. Not a nuclear flash. Not an invading army. Not an angry deity. A civilization undone by the same combination of forces that has threatened every great human society throughout history. Environmental pressure, infrastructure failure, institutional collapse, and the slow accumulation of problems that were each manageable alone but became catastrophic together. The skeletons in the street were not victims of a single moment of destruction. They were the last residents of a city that the world had moved on from. People who stayed when everyone else had already left, who had nowhere else to go, or who simply could not bring themselves to abandon the greatest city their civilization had ever built. And here is the warning that nobody wants to say out loud. The civilization that built Mohenjo-daro did not fall because it was primitive. It did not fall because it was weak. It did not fall because it lacked intelligence or ingenuity or vision. It fell because it could not adapt quickly enough to changes it did not fully understand until it was already too late. A civilization of engineers and planners and builders, brought down not by enemies but by climate shift and institutional decay and the slow erosion of the systems that held everything together. Sound familiar? Subscribe right now and make sure the notification bell is turned on. Because in Part 04 we follow the survivors. We trace where 40,000 people went when they finally walked away from the greatest city of the ancient world. And what we found at the end of that trail will completely change how you understand the history of this entire region. Tell us in the comments. Does the real story of Mohenjo-daro frighten you more than the nuclear myth? Because it should,